We begin our proceedings today with opening remarks by Gill, who is the Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs in the United States of America. Ricky.
Thank you, Gautam, for that kind introduction. Thank you to ORF and the MEA for this wonderful opportunity. On behalf of President Trump and the White House, we'd like to offer our greetings to all of you. It's fantastic to be here in India to participate in Raisina, and I'm really sincerely looking forward to the continued dialogue. As many of you know in this room, the president has wasted absolutely no time since taking office, establishing our relationship with India as an important component of our foreign policy agenda. Just last month, and I'm sure this escaped no attention, President Trump and Prime Minister Modi met at the White House where they celebrated a relationship that is rooted in shared values, mutual respect, and common purpose. Today, I want to reaffirm those commitments made by the United States to bolster the collective prosperity of both these nations through compact or catalyzing opportunities in military partnership, accelerated commerce, and technology. Both of our governments established a roadmap for the U.S.-India partnership that will guide our bilateral engagement across multiple pillars. To ensure the security and freedom of the Indo-Pacific, one of the primary vectors of cooperation between the United States and India is defense. As many of you know, India was designated as the first U.S. major defense partner. And we look forward to this year signing a 10-year framework to continue to build our military partnership for this century. As stated in the leaders' joint statement from the visit, we are already taking steps to make our best technology available, including exploring viable options for fifth-generation fighters and maritime domain awareness technology, as well as emerging technologies in AI-enabled and autonomous systems through what we call the Asia Initiative, or the Autonomous Systems Industry Alliance. Additionally, we hope to expand our co-production and co-development of defense capabilities that are quite innovative. As the world's largest consumers and producers of energy, we have boundless opportunity to partner together to ensure diverse, reliable sources of energy for both India, the wider region, and the entire world. From traditional sources like oil and gas, to development and production of innovative technologies like small modular reactors, the United States remains committed to supplying India with the energy resources to meet its burgeoning energy demand. And we hope to do this in a geopolitically secure and a responsible manner, a way that increases the opportunity set for additional cooperation in the future. It is also an objective of the United States, and again, this was reflected in that very robust joint statement, through Mission 500 to double our bilateral trade with India by 2030. And in light of that goal, we have launched negotiations for a first ever bilateral fair trade agreement to be concluded this year by the time of the Quad Leaders Summit. We cannot fulfill the potential of this partnership and our vision for expanding industry and cooperating on supply chains unless and until we work through the tariff, non-tariff, and technical barriers to trade that hold back our businesses from working with one another. President Trump and Prime Minister Modi committed to partner together to lead the world in technology innovation. And in doing so, they launched a new initiative called the Trust Initiative, or Transforming the Relationship Utilizing Strategic Technology. The Trust Initiative aims to connect our researchers, our universities, our entrepreneurs, our businesses, to drive progress together on what we consider breakthrough technologies. The integration of American technology companies in the Indian subcontinent is inextricably linked to our shared goals of growing our highest value industries together, securing our supply chains from hostile actors, and exporting this innovation to the world. Our strategic partnership between the United States and India under this umbrella, known as the Trust Initiative, will ensure that the technologies of tomorrow belong to free societies. In addition to these bilateral engagements, the U.S.-India partnership also involves and invokes unique regional verticals that have the promise to unlock prosperity and economic opportunity across countries, regions, and continents. From IMEC to I2U2, we will forge new partnerships and revive standing ones to create unprecedented investments across multiple domains, develop new infrastructure to enhance connectivity, and thereby expand the global footprint for our commerce, the likes of which we have not seen before. I believe it's also important, and this is maybe on a somewhat softer note, to point out the people-to-people ties that have brought our countries very closely together. If the contributions of the Indian diaspora in the United States are any indication of what we are capable of, then the potential impact of this partnership truly is without limit. My own story as the son of two Indian American physicians, who's now helping to shape this partnership from the White House, is proof of the powerful diaspora that binds us. Looking back over the recent history of the U.S.-India relationship, I'm truly amazed at how far we have come. And nevertheless, there is still critical work that remains. We must continue to address trade imbalances and remove barriers that hinder the scope of our commerce to ensure that our economic relationship actually becomes as ambitious as the strategic partnership that exists. As President Trump has said, our goal is simple: trade that is reciprocal and fair. And a country's level of commitment to this principle of reciprocity set forth by our president will determine both how, when, and the extent to which the United States engages. President Trump has made himself clear that these American commitments will undergird the existence of a fair system. And so in closing, as we continue our work during Raisina and these critical discussions and moving beyond to a very exciting new frontier, we hope to build a future that is more secure, more prosperous, both at home and abroad. And that is the focus of our administration. Let's recognize that it is up to all of us to realize the promise of that enduring partnership. And we can do so together with expectations, but also positive ambitions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ricky. Now I invite the panel to join us here. We've given Benedetta Berti from the Office of the Secretary General of NATO, Muat Alwari from UAE, Tristan Auriu from France, I apologize, Rory Metcalf from Australia, Dr. Harsh Pant from India, and our moderator, Elena Lazuro from United Kingdom.
Technology, industry, and people. And I think between us, we've all decided that this pretty much includes everything. So our panelists today have this great task of guiding us through the fabulous world of policy planning and strategy making, but focusing really on these new elements that everyone is looking at. Just to say, we have about 50 minutes for the panel. I'll introduce the panelists in a minute. So what we're going to try to do is have them come in on a number of questions and then leave 15 minutes for questions and answers. So do enjoy your meal as we wait for that moment, but also prepare your questions. So we have with us today Benedetta Berti. Actually, the panel has been introduced, so maybe I will not repeat, but really quickly. Benedetta Berti, Director Policy Planning Office, Secretary General NATO. Muat Alwari, Director Policy Planning Department, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, United Arab Emirates. Tristan Auriu, Head of the Policy Planning Department, Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs in France. Rory Metcalf, Head of the National Security College, Australian National University, Australia. and also Hans Sant, who is the vice president of ORF. So we also have the Indian point of view. What we want to discuss under this very interesting title is essentially what are the challenges today for policy planning in a time where elements that perhaps did not used to be at the core of foreign and security policy have now become fundamental, not only in decisions, but also in strategy making, in policy options, but also, and interestingly, on who are the actors to take into account when thinking of partnerships, when thinking of the fora in which to engage. Once upon a time, when I was younger, foreign policy was mostly about states and their representatives meeting. But today, I think our policy planners meet with a host of actors, which include business, they include NGOs, they include technology representatives. So all of that creates a very new environment. And perhaps the first question I'm going to address to all of the panelists for their initial thoughts is, in this world where technology comes in its disruptive but also potentially very constructive manner, where global governance and the actors therein are changing and shifting, where many of the existing knowns are becoming unknowns, what are their main challenges they see for policy planning? And maybe I'll start with Benedetta on this. So we'll go to defense and security proper, but then we'll move into a broader dimension. So Benedetta.
Right. Thank you, Elena. Thank you for giving me the first question and ask me to discuss everything. So I'll try my best in a couple of minutes to set the stage. First of all, I mean, your question is, what are the main challenges to policy planning? I would say maybe firstly, depends what you're planning for. Not to get too meta, but I think that's important. I live by Eisenhower's famous "plans are worthless, planning is everything" approach to policy planning, which means to me policy planning is a way through which you identify what your core national interests are. On that basis, you develop strategies to achieve them. And in that way, it's really an exercise in developing mental agility. So in that sense, it's very important in a world in which you see exponential change, multiple challenges, simultaneity as one of the defining trends of our time. So in that context, policy planning I see as an exercise to test assumptions and probe interest. Challenges. I'll make 3 short points, 3 challenges. Connecting the dots. Fear of being unpopular, and fear of saying no. Maybe I'll elaborate on that. And there's many others, but just to open the discussion. I would say, and these are all mindset challenges. The first challenge that I think we may have in policy planning is, of course, from a public sector perspective, is we operate according to well-defined boxes. Peacetime, wartime, civil, military instrument of power, other instruments of power. That works very well in theory. It doesn't work in the world we live in, which I would say it's much more a world of in-between. Not peace, not war, but certainly contestation, competition as a persistent feature. All instruments of power are being utilized in an increasingly more integrated way. So for us to think in siloed, as opposed to a continuum, represents a problem. There is a desire, I think, to take individual theaters, actors, threat vectors separately. They tend to converge in ways that make planning seem more complicated. So that challenge inherent in the way we function of connecting the dots, I think it's very important one to overcome. I'll be very telegraphic with the other 2 because I see you're looking at me. The other 2, I think, challenges that I think sometimes come in the way is, one, we don't want to say no, but in order to pursue our core national security interests, we need to define them, and then we need to prioritize them. And to prioritize, you need to make concessions. You need to make trade-offs. You have to be able to say no to some things in order to put your core interest at the core. I think sometimes that's difficult, uncomfortable, especially in political settings. We sort of want to do it all, but that's, I think, in a world of competition and contestation, that's not possible. So I think as policy planning, our role is to also say no yes to this. This is what we want to pursue, and so this is what we need to deprioritize for the time being. And lastly, fear of being unpopular, because I think we're doing a lot better in the policy planning community at anticipating disruptive events, the sort of black swan scenarios, but we are a little bit more timid when it comes to discussing uncomfortable realities. In other words, what we're seeing coming, we know it's not going to go our way, but we still hesitate to be the ones in the room saying, actually, it's not happening. What's our plan B? So I'll stop here.
Thank you. I'm not British, but I try to be a British moderator, so to the time. But a couple of very interesting points there, I think. One is the prioritizing, and this is the one I want to move to Muat with, because my understanding is United Arab Emirates, and then there's the connection with technology, has prioritized its role as a technology hub, as an innovation hub, to brand in some ways its type of leadership, which is obviously a policy planning decision. So I wondered if, in your response to the question, what are the main challenges but also opportunities offered by the tech industry and planning nexus, if this is one of the many, or if you'd like to elaborate on more. I think the mic works, yes.
No, I'll start by taking credit for my country's decision to invest in tech. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Look, I just want to answer the original question, and I'll get to the UAE because it links to how I think about this. But the idea of what is the biggest challenge we as policy planners face, I can speak for myself, but I think it's a little bit like that movie, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. Virtually every country in the world is having to confront systemic, transformational change at the national level, at the regional level, and at the global level, all at the same time. So we have these technology-driven shifts, industrial policy, supply chain reorientation, a kind of increase in violent conflict, and geopolitical competition. And the problem, I think, the core issue, is all of this is unfolding, and the tools that we have are just not fit anymore for purpose. The institutions of global governance that we lean to, the sort of frameworks of thinking about how do we deal with these challenges, they're set and designed and kind of developed for a world that doesn't seem to anymore exist. Part of the focus of this session is on individuals, and I think that's really interesting and useful because it touches on the idea that states are no longer, if they ever were, the kind of dominant sole actor in international politics. So we have to kind of deal with these sets of challenges with extraordinary complexity, simultaneous, with tools that seem outdated. And so part of the response is figuring out, how do I adapt my foreign policy making, executing foreign policy. I think for us in the UAE, one of the key things we decided to do is really look at this concept of resilience. How do we build an economy that is resilient to any number of shocks around us, around the world? And so the investment in AI and technology writ large, quantum, biotechnology, etc., reflects that, because these aren't anymore just tools of economic power. They're not a source of prosperity. They're not just a source of prosperity, right? They feed into what does geopolitics look now and in the future. And I think that is a major part of how we kind of thought about responding to the moment. I think there's just one thing I would emphasize, again, from our experience, not just on technology, but also when we hosted COP28 and kind of the actors that we brought into the picture to come up with an outcome that was successful, and that is, get over the idea that it's a state-to-state conversation. Be open to the notion that there are these actors, some of whom are far more influential and powerful than states, that need to be part of the conversation if we are going to produce some results. So corporations, NGOs, non-state actors, they're part of the conversation. And the sooner that we adapt to that, the sooner that we deal with the core challenge. From the UAE's perspective, I think, we made this decision, I would say 5, 6, 7 years ago, and we see increasingly that it is yielding the results that we wanted. That would be my response.
Great, and I'm keeping from that a lot of points. One being, I think, something that many of the speakers, as I understand from our lunch talk, are going to come back to, which is, the link between resilience and technology, but also technology and geopolitics, which is all important. But I'm also glad you introduced the topic of the changing nature of the multilateral system and the actors therein, because it also leads to policy planning decisions about partnerships and who you work with. And I know that later on Tristan will want to come back to this and speak to us about partnerships and relevant initiatives. But we just heard about the very interesting partnership plans between the United States and India. We heard it from the US perspective, and perhaps that's a good point to hear from the Indian perspective what are the main challenges for policy planning, and maybe even bring in also we are in India today, so what are the contours of India's strategy in this changing, disruptive environment?
Oh, I wish I had the answer, and I think the person who I have replaced here would have given you a very different answer, because he, in some ways, represented the state, and I don't. So I will give you an outside-in perspective on this question. And fundamentally, as I see it, as someone who sits outside the policy planning framework, but works with policy planners, I think the biggest challenge, technology comes and goes, structural changes come and go, but I think fundamentally it's an intellectual question. Are we asking the right questions, or are we prisoners of our assumptions? And I think very often you see that institutions crumble not because externally driven forces push them in a certain direction, but because institutions are unable to adapt to the scale and scope of change, and primarily because either they are not asking the right questions, or they are so wedded to the assumptions that they were making that it just, they fall flat in the face of the dramatic shift that often happens. So, big or small, whether you're talking of dramatic shifts, structural changes, or whether you talk of gradual changes in technology, ultimately, I think everything boils down to what I think a couple of other speakers have also reflected on, is this issue of institutional resilience. And I think it comes because of intellectual resilience. If you have that, you will be able to adapt much better. You will be able to ask right questions. You'll be able to provide adequate answers to those questions. And therefore, I think in the context of India, we have seen in some ways, and you talked about India-US partnership, and I think one of the biggest success stories in the context of Indian foreign policy since the end of the Cold War has been this partnership, which has been dramatically transformed. Now, a lot of the times we do put a lot of emphasis on the structural environment, right? Cold War ended, we were prisoners of Cold War thinking, and then suddenly we came out and we started to look at each other as partners, and over a period of time a relationship developed. But I think a lot of that also has to do with rapid adaptation in both bureaucracies, both the US and India. I mean, both bureaucracies are not known to be very nimble, but in this particular case, over the last few decades, if you see the evolution of the relationship, you do see a relationship that is adapting very quickly to the challenges of our times. So from a non-alignment being looked at as a pro-Soviet alignment in the US, to one where India and the US could look at the world through similar prisms, to finding out a resolution to the fundamental problem of the nuclear deal, for example, the nuclear problem, and then now a technology partnership, as was mentioned in the remarks of now energy partnership, economic partnership. I think both bureaucracies today are able to adapt to that new reality because I think fundamentally those questions were asked and they were responded to in some ways. And I would say that at times they were driven by external forces, but there was also an intellectual change in the way we looked at each other. That look, we will not be able to respond to the challenges of the 21st century if we do not adapt adequately and if we do not change our assumptions about each other. And I think that allowed the two nations to develop a partnership that perhaps is much better positioned today than it was, say, a decade back. So briefly, I would just end there.
No, that's very interesting. Thank you. And I think slowly we're listening to the, well, I wouldn't say repetition, but sort of consensus in a certain pattern here, which is sort of disruption and change needing resilience, in turn needing adaptation. And that addresses the bureaucracies, but also the wider issue of the way of work. And also brings in an issue which perhaps later Rory might address, which is, that institutional adaptation also requires a fundamental shift in thinking about the skills of those in the bureaucracies. So I want you to keep that, Rory, for when you come in on this, because we had a good conversation about the role of the college in that regard. But I want to come back to Europe now, to Tristan, for your view on the main challenges, and also in a very particular different way, because France, of course, plans for itself, but it also plans as part of the EU 27. So there you have two layers of it. But also perhaps how does the AI and tech conversation come into that?
Thank you very much. I think a lot has been said with which I very much agree. And when I started as director of policy planning, I've always been reminded of a famous quote by Mike Tyson saying, everybody has a plan until it gets punched in the face, which keeps you modest in developing plans, and scenarios. Still, I'm convinced that, as has been said, it's extremely important for policy planners not to pretend to predict the future, because nobody has a crystal ball, but still to develop plans and strategies to orient actions by our policymakers. And the specificity of policy planning, in my view, is this kind of place where you're close to decision makers, but at the same time you have the liberty and freedom to explore new ideas, to overcome cognitive biases that we always have, by confronted with other viewpoints, exploring new avenues, and be prepared. Mental agility was mentioned, but I very much agree with this, and be ready for paradigm shifts that we're witnessing and going through. When it comes to AI, I think this is exactly a case in point of a technology which has been transforming all sectors of our economy for the past years, and this is accelerating. And here we've been working extremely closely as policy planners with authorities ahead of the Paris AI Summit. And I mention it here because we've been working extremely closely with our Indian colleagues, as this was co-chaired by Prime Minister Modi and President Macron. And I think our intention in this respect, in this summit, was to bring around 100 countries together to confront views and unpack the different dimensions of this nexus of issues. And so we looked at how to, break digital divides, democratize access to AI, at the link between AI and energy, which is absolutely central given the energy costs of AI, and how to use AI to also fight climate change. And also, we gathered, all actors from governments, NGOs, scientists, as was mentioned by my UAE colleagues, to look at the governance of these new objects in a new manner. And the final point I would mention when it comes to policy planning, to complement what's been said, I think policy planning is this part of governments where you can explore new ideas with partners and provide ground for partnerships. And I mentioned India as a key partner for the AI Summit, and we are extremely willing to support India for the next AI Summit next year, and working very closely with our Indian colleagues in this respect. And another example of partnership is the one we've been developing with the UAE, to actually develop what will be the biggest data center in Europe, which will be located in France through an incredible partnership with the UAE. And I think this is a key thing when we're talking about this nexus between technology, industry, power, politics. It was mentioned also in the keynote speech. I think developing partnerships with like-minded countries is absolutely key, and looking at it from a national interest perspective, should not exclude the fact that we work very closely with partners and engage through investments, through sharing of technologies, and also through exchanging between our startup ecosystems as we do with India. So these are just a few reflections, but happy
Thank you
to
very
continue.
much. And I'll go to Rory in a minute, but I do have a follow-up, a quick one for you, Tristan, because you mentioned partners several times, and I think there's a point there. So you mentioned partners, but you always referred to states, countries as partners. But in your remarks, you also mentioned that the aim is to also bring in the entrepreneurs, the scientists, the non-governmental stakeholders of this changing business of geopolitics that now has technology as a key part of it. So your definition of partner in this multi-stakeholder conversation.
Thank you very much for that question, because it gives me the occasion to insist on the fact that when it comes to developing national strategies, actually the whole question we're thinking about in France is how do we build the best framework to actually foster innovation through investing in skills, in universities, in research. How do we set the right regulation that does not impede innovation? And foster competition, and how do we attract investment? Because there will be some public investment, but most of the investment we're talking about is from the private sector in France, in Europe, but also from abroad. And working on this attractiveness with partners that are coming from the private sector is absolutely key. And just to give an example, this year, we hosted a summit for attractiveness in France, where major investments were announced by Microsoft, Amazon, key digital companies, and we're extremely pleased to attract those investments. And we're doing our best, actually, to boost this attractiveness. So, just to say that partner is going beyond government. I mentioned private companies and scientists. You mentioned it. Actually, we opened the AI Summit, and it was a very deliberate choice with hosting what we saw as the best scientists on AI to actually go also into research when it comes to those issues, because it's not only for government to deal with this.
Thank you. You mentioned scientists, and I copied it, so I don't take the credit. But you do make a very good opening for me to move to Rory for his introductory remarks, because you also talked about skills, and nowhere better than a college to discuss skills. But first, the challenges for the planning, and where does the training come in?
Look, thank you, Chair. Great to be here. Great to be back at Raisina, and I guess at one level, I am an imposter sitting on a panel with policy planners because I'm an educator rather than a policy planner. I have the opportunity to suggest ideas and take no responsibility for their implementation. But these issues are extremely serious. Building effectively, I think, integrated national interest, national resilience, national security responses across all of our countries, but also, wherever possible, seeking to maintain cooperation in that space. And as the Chair noted, my day job is leading a national security college at the Australian National University. And our mission there is really to be a force multiplier for government, a capability builder for the Australian government, whole of government, but also whole of society. I have 19 government agencies that are my stakeholders, plus partners in industry, civil society, and a leading university. And therefore, in a microcosm, the work we do every day is trying to build that whole of nation response to the challenges that we're speaking about here. I was impressed by the Mike Tyson quote earlier because, of course, in a way, we're not talking about planning here, we're actually talking about strategy. And the difference between a plan and a strategy is that when you have a plan, you're not necessarily accounting for somebody deliberately trying to obstruct, thwart and harm you. A strategy means that you are accounting for risk. And I think on all of the issues we're talking about here at Raisina, whether it's the geopolitical tensions, whether it's threats to social cohesion, whether it's the impact of disruptive technologies, whether it's climate and environment and resource issues, in all cases now we're looking at much more complex risks than, I guess, linear planning can account for. So I guess I would plead for thinking whole of government in the way we're defining national responses. I do like the fact that there's been already some clues in this panel about the need to look to the future. Really, we need to be looking intergenerationally with policy planning. A couple of data points that I might conclude with before I encourage the wider conversation. I think one of the virtues of having an Australian perspective on this panel is that I can very much say that Australia has the problems of a middle power, and so many of the countries that have delegates here at Raisina are middle powers or smaller powers. We're countries that can potentially defend ourselves, but we're not very good at coercion. We're not very good at making life hard for others, but we're not necessarily toughened for the current environment. And I think that the lessons Australia's experienced, certainly in the past 10 years, dealing, for example, with great power coercion, we had some pretty confronting times with China some years ago, for example, have begun to build a national security response that is much more the sum of our parts, that's beginning to point towards that integrated whole of government planning that I think this panel is about. And just a few examples to take away there, and they're not all...
Just relatively quickly, because we don't have that much time.
Yeah, well, I'll give you three or four sort of data points that they're not all sort of China-centric. You know, what do we do about providers of critical technologies to our infrastructure that are either linked with state actors or that are private vendors that for some reason are not trusted and not consistent with our national values? How do we engage citizens? I think people is part of the topic of the panel here today. How do we seek to inoculate our citizenry from the risks, for example, of disinformation, AI-enabled disinformation in electoral processes, or other negative impacts of what are otherwise positive technologies? Those are some of the problems that a middle power like my country is starting to deal with, and I'm sure that there's many other perspectives that we'd love to share in this room. So thank you.
Yes, and I encourage those perspectives to come in the Q&A. Thank you. So we're going to try to go for quick answers here, but Benedetta, sorry, next one for you. Whole of society approach, we just heard this. So technology is bringing that approach very much into the field of discussion, whole of society preparedness. You mentioned connecting the dots as one of the challenges for policy planners. So could you elaborate a bit on that in the sense, you know, these new types of threats, technology, what are they enablers in connecting the dots? Are they new challenges? Are they expanding your core mission?
Okay, a lot to tackle. The technology is it's a tool through which you influence strategy. It is a tool through which you shape the security environment. It is an enabler. It is a potential for opportunities in terms of growth, in terms of prosperity, in terms of security. And of course, the exact opposite is also true. It is also potentially a national security vulnerability. It's also potentially a risk to connectivity. So it is. So to answer your question, it is the best way to future-proof our strategies when it comes to the role of exponential technologies is to account for both the risks and the opportunities and to mainstream it in the way we think about strategy making. And I think that's one element. When we're thinking about connecting those dots, it is dots between theaters, dots between domains, dots between what is the strategic, the political, and the technical. And that's where technological development becomes not just a tool through which you implement your strategies, but by itself, by pursuing technological supremacy, you're also playing in a field of geopolitical competition. It is all of this, and we need to think about all of this in its complexity. You like to ask me the meta questions, so I'll stick to the meta. So I think that if I had to give an examples from where I sit, so in the defense in the defense field, well, one of our assumption is that battlefield primacy will be determined also through technological dominance. So technological dominance becomes a key currency in building and strengthening the military instrument of power. So that would be my bottom line. How do you pursue it? And then you go back into what all the other panelists have said more eloquently than me. You open you open your table up and you redefine what it means to have a security partnership. It's state to state, it's state defense company, it is the defense prime, it is the tech companies, it is the startups, it is all of the above, and also and only by nurturing this vibrant, integrated, in my context, transatlantic defense ecosystem, but in other contexts with other allies and partners, that's the key to supply chain security, defense innovation, and ultimately a stronger and more sustainable military instrument of power. That's the quickest I can do this.
Thank you very much. But you put a very good point on the table, which is from the NATO perspective, of course, technology and defense, it seems it's a natural link. But when we look at the foreign policy planning perspective, of course, tech and industry is dual use. There's the defense aspect, and then there's civilian aspect. And what I was wondering if you might come in on this, again, going back to the innovation focus, where's the balance between defense and civil uses of it, and how does a policy planner decide, what the country is going to do?
I think this is a set of technologies that are extraordinarily adaptable to the needs of any particular country, both its development, economic needs, its security needs. The balance is struck by the needs of the country, fundamentally. So in the case of the UAE, we are obviously a major oil exporter, and that has had oil has had an outsized influence on our economy for the last 50 years. So one of the key kind of objectives we have from the adaptation, the adoption and the investment in AI is to kind of facilitate that transition away from an oil-based economy, right? And so, that features in the way you think about foreign policy. That features in the way you think about particular partnerships, because you're trying to create mechanisms, infrastructures that enable cooperation on AI in those fields that are particularly important for you. And I think that has traditionally, or at least, well, I don't want to say traditionally because this has not been a very long time, but that has been one of the key motivators in our approach to the development of the AI industry in the UAE. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to bring in climate change because we are supposed to bring climate change in as well as the content part of challenges that can be addressed with technology and industrial innovation. And maybe I'd like to ask Han about India on this, because India, perhaps one of the major challenges faced by India is climate change. And how does that get integrated into considerations about does the consideration about how technology, industry, certain voices of people be harnessed in the planning about how to counter this challenge?
Well, I think that has been a global phenomenon in the sense that this is not India specific, but across the world, when you have had big issues like climate come to the global agenda or national agenda, they've been driven from a bottom-up sentiment rather than top-down. So policymakers often try to ignore some of the voices, which eventually make themselves have made themselves heard in this particular context, climate and climate activism, the partnership of the state with certain key stakeholders in this conversation has allowed climate agenda to become the kind of, allowed it to attain the kind of potency that it has today. And I think in that context, there's a broader point, somewhat and I'm also like Rory, looking at this from outside in. A lot of the changes that you see and the scale and scope of change has been talked about, how fast things are changing. But I think one of the things that you are also witnessing in the Indian context, the Indian bureaucracy, like all bureaucracies, has been resistant to change. But what tends to happen is that when you start opening up, and in the last few years, we have seen an opening up, particularly of the Indian Foreign Service and the talent pool that is needed to fill certain voids. So certain sectors which are, where if you pass a generalist examination and become a civil servant, you have a certain skill set. But that does not necessarily mean that the skill set is the right one for contemporary times. So how do you either have to upskill yourself, or you get talent from outside? And I think that balance, at least in the Indian foreign policy establishment, Indian policy-making establishment, you see being made. And I guess it's true of all policy institutions or policy planning units. But I think the more that happens, the more adaptable that institution becomes to meet the challenges of its times, rather than looking at it from a very insular point of view. And I think that therefore addresses the question of you need to bring in those stakeholders inside, because otherwise the conversations would be very hierarchical and perhaps not be very responsive to the challenges that we are facing.
A very good point, and it opens up space of thinking about formats and ways to do things right. So I want to do two things. This is my cue time to open up the floor, so please do raise your hands if you have questions. And while you do so, I'm going to ask Rory to very, very quickly outline, you mentioned Australia, a middle power, and one that has an interesting amount of supply chain parts to play, and these are very important, of course, in both technology and industry. So really briefly, if you want to elaborate on this in like 1 or 2 minutes, and then I'll take the first question over there.
Well, look, I think one of the big questions for this conference is about technology and resources. And so you look at countries like Australia that are very richly endowed in a lot of the resources that are required, including these days critical minerals. The challenge, of course, is that for countries like Australia, we don't necessarily have either the investment pool or certainly the technology depth for processing value add. So how do you build policy frameworks around that ensure that you're working with friends and partners that have convergent interests, and to ensure that this is economically viable? This is a major problem for a country like Australia. In our case, it's really about developing very clear national interest frameworks to guide those decisions, and that's really about bringing the private sector into a very frank conversation about national interest.
Great.
We're just beginning that journey.
Thank you for that. So we'll take the first question from the lady over there. Please, if you can identify yourself, and if it's for a specific panelist, please let them know who it is.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you to all the panel members for this insightful discussion, and also to Mr. Ricky Gill for his opening remarks. My name is Sonam Yangchin. I'm from Bhutan. So I've learned that recently Bhutan is, our country is among the those facing potential travel restrictions to the United States. Given my country's strong commitment to the peace, democratic values, and sustainable development, along with our low crime rates and stable governance, this really raises important question about how such policy decisions are made by the most developed country in the world. Could any of the panel members provide insights into how this criteria or considerations?
Okay, I think we understand the question. Thank you.
Okay.
It's about how policy planners make these kind of decisions. I think that's how it fits here. But I'm not sure on this panel we have the person who could respond to this. Very legitimate question, but I wonder. Yes, Rory.
Just a brief aside. Some of my best students are Bhutanese, so please send your best students to Australia.
A question from the same table, the gentleman.
Yes, my name is Julian Ringhoff. I'm here with the Mercator Foundation, but I work for the European Commission at DG Connect. Yesterday someone said the one thing we learn from history is that we never learn from history. And I'm wondering, in this context, I have the impression that we sometimes pretend like it's a new thing that technology shapes, power and global politics, where of course it's not a new phenomenon, and there are many examples. And so my question would be, where do you see the key differences today? And of course you may say, dual use character of goods, but that's also not new. You may say private sector actors, that's also not new. You just have to go back to colonial times, or you have to go back Wassenaar arrangement, dual use. So yeah, where do you see the key difference in the role technology plays today, given that it has always played a role?
And is this to all the panelists or
yes,
specifically? Okay. Well, who wants to go first? Yes, one.
I can try. Look, I don't know. I think I would question if the scale of the change produced by AI is comparable to anything we've experienced before. The way it will permeate every aspect of our economies, of our societies, of our politics, of our defense strategies, I think is unprecedented. Now, I studied international relations theory, so I probably don't know, but that's at least my kind of guess. What is different, maybe I'd add this, is you're right, technology and the way it changed the world. We've experienced episodes of this in the past, the role of corporate influence, for example. I think part of what's interesting now is who's corporate influenced exerted on whom. Historically, the flow of this process has been from one direction. What is happening, particularly because of AI, is that is a little bit reversed. And I think that's what makes this a really interesting moment.
Benedetta?
Can I first of all, I will agree that it's about scale and scope and the simultaneity, and the compounded effects of multiple emerging and disruptive technologies coming together that I think are starting to deliver really transformative effects. So I think that's one point. The other point is we can certainly look at different historical times and learn lessons. It's important. To some extent, there's never nothing new under the sun. Fine. At the same time, I think when you look at speed, scope, and scale, you are seeing a different story being written today, one we should be responsive to. What I will agree with you, although you didn't say it, so I'm really making a point and attributing to you, which is, Speakers 101, is any time that we adopt only a monolithic lens through which we look at reality, then we fail because then we're surprised. So when, for example, in defense innovation, when it was all about technology, only technology is going to transform the nature of warfare. And then you see a war like what is unfolding in Ukraine, where actually some of the military effects are achieved by, I would say World War I and World War II type of technology. So every time you only adopt one lens through which you analyze historical change, then you probably are going to be blindsided. I mean, so there I would agree to something you didn't say.
It's a very good rhetorical technique. It's noted. Tristan, you wanted to come in.
Well, very briefly, just to say that I very much had the point that the whole history of technological innovation is about horizontal technologies changing the face of the world. So I very much share the point. The only point I would make to complement what's been said is the speed at which a technology is being developed is affecting all sectors of society and the economy. And the very speed of that paradigm shift we're in. And what I'm referring, and you're working for the European Commission, I used to work at the European Commission before, I think it poses a very serious challenge for policymakers, because the time to actually think through the different implications of a technology that is developing so fast makes, structurally speaking, the public sphere lagging behind schedule, and it's driven by the private sector, which is where the innovation is being developed, and so on and so forth. So that creates a specific challenge just in this respect, I would say, and that poses an interesting question for governments, policy planners, you name it. But I think this is maybe the specific thing, and we can see this space only accelerating.
Thank you. There's a question in the back there, and then in the front, Xenia. So we'll take these two together.
Hi, I'm Murli Nair from the Bertelsmann Foundation in Germany. It feels like there's almost an AI arms race, and everyone wants to get ahead. And Europe has suddenly woken up and realized that, okay, regulation is probably not the best way to go ahead. But at the same time, are you seeing that the guardrails are all being broken and thrown away? So is there no one standing up for public good? I don't have a particular...
You don't have a specific goal. Maybe Tristan, because you mentioned Europe. And we'll take the question by Xenia Wickett.
Xenia Wickett, Wickett Advisory. A number of the panels talked quite extensively about the fact that you need to get other actors beyond governments involved in this conversation. And, you know, for 30 years, we've been talking about public-private partnerships. And I haven't, my experience has been that that is extraordinarily hard to do. And Tristan, you just raised one of the challenges, which is different timings and different motivations or incentives. I'd be really interested if any of you have any advice or insights or that actually could help people to achieve greater success in public-private partnership. What have you learned? What works?
Thank you. So we have two very good questions. Okay, we'll add a third one, but really quick one, and then we'll go back to the panel for them to close. The lady, yes, back there.
Thank you so much, everybody, for that session. My question, I'm Samriddhi Khandelwal. I'm a student of Nalanda University. And my question will be from a student perspective. It is for the whole panel. How can our policy planning effectively counter challenges posed by dual-use technologies to reconcile short-term security imperatives with our long-term sustainability and resilience objectives?
That's an excellent question. Thank you very much. So we have 3 minutes. Let's have 30 seconds from each panelist. So Rory, you can go first. We'll go in reverse order. Any of these questions. You don't need to answer all of them.
I'll go straight for the question on public-private partnership. Well, I think, again, from the Australian experience, part of the solution has been, I have to say, has been through legislation. And so putting effectively security obligations on the private sector, especially when it comes to critical infrastructure. The challenge is when your private sector partners are effectively multinationals and don't have, if you like, a national interest bone that you can sort of appeal to. And I think there it's been much more, frankly, about consultation and dialogue. That's pretty weak, I know, but unfortunately that's been the only way forward.
Thank you. Tristan.
Yeah, very quickly on the point of the public good, because it was precisely the aim of the AI summit we held last month in Paris to precisely push this idea that beyond the pure race for AI, there is a need to, as I said, democratize access to AI, and because at the moment it's restricted to a very limited number of countries, and within those countries to a very limited number of people. So that's one example where we think that for the public good there is a case to be made for diffusion of that technologies and making it accessible to a wider number of countries and people within countries, and where for public good reason that's important. And second, the other example I briefly referred to it is the link with energy and climate change, and I think there is a great case to be made for AI to be used in this respect. And just very quickly on public-private partnerships, to think that I'm talking, of course, from a public perspective, but I would say that I think on the government side, it needs further risk-taking, which is completely alien to some part of the administration. But we should look at more experimental way of legislating things, trying things. Yeah. So that's how I would put it. So.
Thank you.
Just very briefly, I think Raisina dialogue is a very good example of public-private partnership, and hopefully it has changed both the MEA and ORF for the better. And I think both of us have imbibed some of the other, and that I think has allowed both institutions to in some ways rethink their assumptions.
Indeed, you have all these actors that we mentioned present here. What?
Yeah, just one last thing. Look, on the regulation, someone asked about how to do public-private partnership. I think it's for the public to be humble. I mean, like governments, right? Like, we don't know this stuff. I sit with private sector people in the UAE who work on AI, and I literally feel like I'm in school. So there's a need, and it is a little bit weak, like dialogue. It's not concrete as an answer, but I can't think of anything else. On the public good. A lot of this conversation is driven by its geopolitical implications and its economic implications, and that makes a lot of sense. But there is an amazing amount of potential, particularly when we start talking about development. The potential leap in development status that AI could enable in a lot of countries around the world is, I don't want to sound like a tech optimist, because I don't think they're popular anymore. But I really do think it is transformative. I mean, the potential is there. So part of the conversation that people should force onto this is that development use, and Tristan mentioned the climate change aspect, and yeah, for sure. So, we have to force it into the conversation rather than kind of, put up with the dominance of this sort of geopolitics and the economics.
Thank you. And Benedetta, final word?
I'm staring at a
Me
ginormous
too.
time is up screen, so I'll be very quick and just absolutely agree with the points made on how, from a public sector, one of the way to unlock better public-private partnerships is to really focus on the word partnership. It's not just a dialogue, co-develop, co-create, actively listen, actively engage, become. I like the idea of being humbler. I think we can all. I think that applies to multiple sectors, but I also think from our side, simpler. Try to simplify bureaucracy, leaner, more accessible. Those will already go a long way. And there was a very, very fascinating question on how you strike the balance between security and when it comes to emerging and disruptive technologies. Meanwhile, my screen is going wild, so I'll be really telegraphic. I think, again, from a government perspective, from a public perspective, you think about what are the guardrails, what are the principles, what are the effects that you really want to either harness or what are the risks you want to minimize, and then you enter into a dialogue, remaining flexible. I would avoid spending a lot of time in process and developing rules that by the time they are approved are already obsolete, and instead really try to think about what is the framework, how do you build security and through principles. That's very vague, but the screen is exploding. So
thank you very much, Benedetta. So I think the word that describes this panel and that was mentioned more than anything is everything, everywhere, all at once. I think we covered an immense number of topics, many of which I hope we will discuss again next year. I leave without having asked my last question, but it's okay. It was just going to be AI, tool or actor, maybe a panel for next year. To point that we haven't talked about budget, which I assume policy planners think about a lot, but also potentially a panel for next year. And third, to say thank you for your attention. Thank you to our speakers. And will AI moderate panels in the future? I doubt it will manage to keep to 50 minutes with such excellent speakers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much.